If you've been watching my videos for any amount of time, you probably know I'm not a big fan of single-use or disposables in general. I personally think that a circular economy is the actual solution to the waste crisis that we currently face. But with that being said, I get asked so often about, is this material good?
Is this material good? Is this one worse?
Is this one better?
I heard this is good.
All sorts of different things like that. And especially right now because of COVID, there are a lot more disposables in the world, so people are using them a lot more because they don't have another choice. So they're asking, what should I be choosing? And there's also a concern about people with certain disabilities or things that they don't have access to, asking me, what's the best choice when it comes to choosing something that's packaged and something that's disposable? And hence, this video was born. I'm going to be discussing a bunch of different materials that I'm going to try to break down the positives and the negatives of, but I want you to keep in mind that at the end of the day, we can only do as much as the society we live in allows us to. And I'm so sick of feeling like the weight of the world is on my shoulders, or that I have to figure out the perfect answer for each question I ask about sustainability. Which is why at the end of the day, I'm trying to focus more on talking to your representatives, reaching out to businesses and criticizing them when it's necessary, and showing up for things like climate action. I'm doing a really big push here because the upcoming climate strike is on September 24th, and I would absolutely love to see all of you out there, wherever the respective closest one is to you. Please attend. I'll leave a link in the description to find the closest one to you. My personal favorite new quote that I came up with recently is, do your best and advocate for the rest. And I think that says it all. On top of September being when the climate strike is, it's also dubbed Environmental Awareness Month, or Sustainable September. Obviously, one of the pillars of this video and this channel is to reduce your waste, so I've partnered with CVS on today's video to talk a little bit about how they can help us do that. Like I said, there's been a lot more disposables because of the panini and whatnot, and I don't think they're going away anytime soon. And since we are leading into the holiday season, if your family is super adamant about using disposables, like mine is, then CVS has some better options than some of the other materials we're gonna talk about today. Their Total Home Earth Essentials includes compostable plates, biodegradable cups, and FSC certified utensils. All materials which we will discuss in depth in this video. And most importantly, like I said, I'm trying to shift my focus from being so much on you and me's responsibility to save the planet and talk more about what corporations can be doing. So CVS actually has an awesome initiative and a lot of reports to prove what they're doing, that they're trying to reduce their environmental impact by 50% by 2030. Earlier this year, CVS halted the sale of single-use straws, all plastic cutlery, and all styrofoam cups, plates, and bowls as part of that commitment. So not only do they have better options for you, but they're also someone that you can feel good about supporting, because they're taking responsibility for doing their part as well. You can check out the Total Home Earth Essentials line linked in the description. First material up is paper. I think this is pretty agreeable that most people, when they think of the most environmentally friendly option, their first thought is paper. So what are the positives of paper, right? Well, it's made of something that is renewable, because trees are technically renewable, though a lot of them grow very slow, and a lot of timber forests that they use to make paper is not the most sustainable in terms of the resources that go into that stuff and the way it is grown. But it is a compostable material, which I think is why a lot of people think of paper as the most, sustainable option. However, paper is not infinitely recyclable, and I never hear people talking about that. Over time, paper fibers can get to be too short and not high quality enough to be made back into the same product. Estimates I've seen is that paper can only be recycled around 5 times before it needs virgin material to be input to recycle it. And trees take a lot of time to renew, right? It's renewable, but on average, the average timber tree takes about 20 years to grow to the point where they're gonna cut it down to make paper. And a lot of what has happened over time are forests that are really important for carbon sequestration have been slashed and cut down to create these monocultures of trees that we're currently growing for paper. And these types of forests completely lack biodiversity, which is really important because we're losing a lot of it to climate change as well. But around 50 to 70% of paper is recycled, which is a really good thing. So, some positives, some negatives. Now, in contrast to typical paper that is grown from timber, we have bamboo. So bamboo has all of the benefits of timber-grown paper, that it is compostable, recyclable, all those sort of things, but it grows a lot faster and therefore takes a lot less resources. Now, this video is focused on packaging and disposables, not on clothing. I don't necessarily know for sure if I think bamboo clothing is sustainable because of the process bamboo has to go through to be turned into clothing or cloth fibers. But I think bamboo as a usable, disposable packaging material is a better option for sure than paper. Some bamboo can literally grow 3 feet in a 24-hour period. Tell me the last time you saw a tree do that. This is largely because it's in the grass family. So there is a similar issue of monocultures like there is for timber for bamboo, but you can use that same amount of space to grow a lot more since it grows so fast. Because of this, the surrounding area is often untouched, and so it doesn't have the same negative biodiversity impacts necessarily that timber forests do. And a concern that a lot of people have is that by using bamboo for more things, we're taking it away from the pandas who are obviously suffering. I think they are endangered right now. But also I'm sure that a lot of people realize that most things that we use for commercial products are commercially grown. Usually they're not just gone out into the wild and harvested. That would be really unsustainable in terms of business practices and obviously in terms of the environment. Still, I think it's important to look at the brand that you're buying from and make sure that they have some sort of ethos to be sure that it is responsibly sourced. But most of the time it's grown for harvesting, not just wildly harvested. Those two materials you might have been familiar with, but this one is one that doesn't get talked about a lot, but I'm actually a pretty big fan of, and it's called wheat straw. Wheat straw is essentially an agriculture waste product. After harvesting the grain, the wheat stalk is normally disposed of in compost facilities or sometimes landfills. By fashioning the natural wheat stalk into a replacement for plastic straws or into other things that you can use it for, which we'll talk about in a second. But by doing this, we reduce both wheat waste that's going to landfill or possibly compost and reducing plastic waste. No additives or processing is required with natural wheat stalks to make the straws. There's actually also flax straw, which is a waste product of the agriculture industry, which is an example of what Pila uses to make their cases. So I definitely think using waste to create another product that would traditionally be made from plastic is a really, really sustainable thing to choose. With that being said, a lot of people ask me about bioplastics, compostable plastics. It's complicated. There are some pros and cons to this. So I personally think one of the biggest cons to these is it's confusing for the recycling system as well as for consumers like you and me. All these different materials are made from different plant resources, but whether it's made from corn and combined with some other sort of polymer, whether it's constructed to be biodegradable or compostable, there's so many different questions, and it's very confusing for people to hear sugarcane packaging, but that's not biodegradable or compostable, but it is recyclable. And then to go somewhere else and get a smoothie in a cup and then tell you this is made from corn and it's not recyclable, but it is compostable. It's all so confusing, and I think that messes with us trying to figure out how to sort things and how to choose things, and also recyclers, because they're receiving things that look like plastic but aren't going to break down into the same bits that they need to process it as plastic recycling. My opinion on different types of bioplastics or compostable, plant-based, whatever plastics also differs a little bit for me depending on what material it's made out of. Because some of the benefits of using these crops are that a lot of them are carbon sequestering. So by making products out of these instead of the traditional petroleum-based plastic, we're actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere, whereas plastic is obviously incredibly toxic and polluting to our atmosphere. But it's a little bit complicated because corn, especially grown in the US, is oftentimes not sustainably farmed whatsoever. Monocultures out the wazoo, as we know. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this issue. And corn is one of the top 2 contributing crops to dead zones and eutrophication, which I have a whole video about. Oh, nope, it's up here. I'll link it up here. Obviously, that type of crop has its own environmental impact aside from just being a renewable resource. So while I do think that some of these plastics can be better for the environment overall, I also think we can't just say that they are the solution and leave it at that. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, isn't it always? Now for the quintessential material of the zero waste movement, glass. If you came to the zero waste movement within the last I'd say 2 years, you probably think of glass as maybe not the most sustainable material. But in 2016, when I started identifying as zero waste, or that I was working on it, I was always thinking of choosing glass over plastic because it was more recyclable and infinitely recyclable. Glass does get a positive for that. But over time, more and more has come to light about the actual full environmental footprint of glass, and so I want to talk a little bit about that. So the positives of glass. We've already got that it's infinitely recyclable. And that's it. This perfectly embodies my frustration with the zero waste movement and what I've been saying for literally years. Looking at only one part of the life cycle and calling it sustainable and leaving it at that is completely counterproductive, because we're ignoring, when we look at this one positive, all of the negatives, which we're going to go through. So glass is actually made from sand, which you might think of as a renewable resource, or you might think we have plenty of sand in the world to go around. But actually the world's sand reserves that we use and can be used to make glass are actually running quite low. And since sand is a natural material and not necessarily able to be grown and farmed like some of the other crops that we've talked about, when we go into the areas to extract that sand, obviously it has impacts on the entire ecosystem surrounding that. I'm hoping you learned this back in like maybe 11th grade biology, but the way we consider a material to be renewable or not is if it can be replenished in the amount of time that we use it. And sand, because it cannot regenerate on the scale at which we are currently using it, it is not considered renewable. I know we talked about this positive, but here are some of the negatives that come along with that. Glass recycling is currently being removed from a lot of cities, including one that my friend Bailey lives just outside of San Antonio. They no longer have glass recycling. And that's because it's not profitable. We have to remember that recycling is a business, and if something doesn't make financial sense for these businesses, they're not going to continue with it. It's also very hazardous because it breaks, and that means it's hazardous from the people in the recycling facilities, for the people who put the stuff on the shelves at the stores, and for you and me. And most importantly, it's freaking heavy. Not only in terms of distribution, moving glass from wherever it's manufactured all the way over to the store and then home for you, but also in terms of recycling. So when the city has to collect it, put it on those trucks, drive that truck all around the city collecting everybody's recycling, move it to the recycling facility, and then to wherever it goes after that. It's incredibly heavy and therefore really, really fuel intensive. And one of the biggest downsides that I don't think a lot of people consider is that glass doesn't preserve things in ways that other materials can. Some materials that we're gonna get to today. But I'll leave a link below to the podcast I did with Carlos from Enval, which is a man trying to create a recycling system for things that right now are not currently recyclable. And he does a really great comparison for those compared to glass, because glass is not even feasible packaging to preserve some of the foods that we currently buy in other packaging materials. Another mark against glass for me is that it is incredibly energy intensive to create. We need furnaces that can heat this material up to 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit to create glass. So you can only imagine it's an incredibly resource intensive material to create. And I've got another really negative mark for the glass recycling. Only around 30% of glass in the US has been recycled. What about aluminum though? Because I'm seeing a lot more brands capitalize on this whole plastic free narrative, right? I think there's something to be said for the zero waste movement in pushing brands to actually change. I just feel like the scale on which they changed was a little slow, and they didn't do as good of a job as they could, because like I said, I'm seeing a lot of big name brands like Colgate capitalize on the opportunity to put their mouthwash in an aluminum container and call it sustainable. But I'm gonna give you a few reasons why I don't think that's accurate. Same thing for glass over here. Aluminum is infinitely recyclable. That's it. Oh, actually, there is one benefit to glass and aluminum that I didn't mention, and that is that they can't break down into microplastics. Don't forget, that is also an important thing. So there is another benefit to them. I think these brands that are switching from plastic to aluminum and throwing their hands up and calling that sustainable is sus, but I don't mean sustainable. Aluminum is a highly processed material, and it's not actually naturally occurring, if you didn't know. To get aluminum, we actually mine for bauxite, and the stat that blows my freaking mind is that for every pound of aluminum produced, there is an equal ton to a ton and a half of bauxite that is waste. That is insane. But the most unfortunate part is we don't know what to do with this bauxite because there's not a market for it currently, for it to be resold, reused, recycled. And so instead what we're doing is burying it in holes in the ground. And because a lot of these times these mines are in places that don't have strict environmental regulations, we've already seen examples of bauxite ruining water sources for communities. Once again, aluminum takes an insane amount of energy to create because it is a material that needs to be melted down. So here are your negatives. The current recycling rate for aluminum in the US is around 50%. I think a lot of people confuse aluminum for steel, but they're not the same thing. And actually a lot of the cans that you see on your shelves in your supermarket are steel, not aluminum. And the really big issue with the materials like aluminum and steel is they have to be mined, which is an incredibly destructive process in general, right? We are literally clear cutting forests, destroying biodiversity, digging into the earth, which oftentimes is done in incredibly unethical ways. Steel also requires a ton of energy, which is around 1500 degrees Fahrenheit that they have to heat it up to. And these furnaces are pretty much constantly running because I'm sure a lot of you are aware. Well, maybe your dad never said this to you. My dad was such an ass about the heat and the AC. And I get TikToks like that. So let me know if your dad was one of those that was like,
Don't touch the fucking furnace.
Firing up a furnace is definitely more energy intensive than just keeping it running in most situations. So these furnaces are just constantly consuming energy to create these products, which obviously contributes to climate change. And one of the reasons I'm so frustrated with businesses using things like aluminum or steel and just calling it sustainable is because they're using virgin materials instead of using recycled materials. But actually, specifically when it comes to steel, I found out that a lot of times when it is recycled materials, it's just not labeled. Around 70% of steel and packaging is recycled materials, and even higher for vehicles and appliances, coming in at 88% for appliances, and 95% of steel used in vehicles is recycled steel. Now I'm breaking each of these down as if what we're talking about is a virgin material, and I'll get to what I think of recycled materials a little bit later. Then we have thin plastics, and I'm specifying this because they're very different. There are actually over 50 different types of plastics out there, but the most common ones we see are a thin plastic, flimsy plastic that we interact with all the time, and number one plastic, which is a harder plastic, which we'll talk about separately from this one. But let's start with the obvious negatives, which is that plastic is made from petroleum, which we don't like. And as of right now, it is incredibly difficult to recycle thin plastics. You cannot recycle thin plastics in most curbside recyclings. I say most because ours personally, you can bundle them up into a bundle of around 40, and then the recycling system will let you put them in there because it's easy to remove before they throw it into the recycling stuff. And a study found that the average piece of plastic is only used for around 12 minutes and then discarded and remains on this earth forever. And I know in the zero waste movement, plastic has been deeply, deeply villainized, but I think when you start to look at the overall footprint of plastic, it actually makes a lot of sense why it became such a highly used material. It's super lightweight, right? So all of the issues that come with steel, aluminum, glass are not associated with using a thin plastic. And when I talk about these thin plastics, I don't mean that we should be using like single-use grocery bags and then just saying whatever, this is sustainable. Because again, I personally think that a circular economy is the solution. But I'm talking about when we consider things like packaged goods. If something can be packaged in a thin plastic instead of packaged in something like aluminum, it's going to be more sustainable to ship that all over the place. Before we get to the mixed material, let's talk a little bit about hard plastic because they're very different. Thin plastics, incredibly hard to recycle. Harder plastics, like plastics number one, much, much more recyclable. Plastic is still a material that cannot be infinitely recyclable, meaning its quality breaks down over time. And that's honestly one of the main reasons that plastic is not the most sustainable material, because it's pretty much impossible to create a circular economy using the plastic. Say if you're trying to choose between a plastic pasta jar and a glass pasta jar. That plastic is a lot more recyclable than most other plastics because of how it's been created. And glass, obviously we already talked about all the negatives of that. So they are the most recyclable, but they are also some of the most common items found as litter. But obviously in the pasta jar comparison, shipping these types of plastics is going to be a lot less energy intensive than shipping glass. And these hard plastics do still have the unfortunate possibility of breaking down into microplastics, which are essentially impossible to remove from our water sources as of right now. But things like mixed materials, I think, get a really bad rep because they can't even be recycled. But I think that's really unfortunate that our view of what is and isn't sustainable is what is recyclable, because when it comes to preserving food properly, for food not going bad and therefore creating more waste because that food went bad, mixed materials are excellent. When it comes to packaging things so that you can fit more on a truck and so that that truck has lighter weight, mixed materials are the winner overall. When it comes to the energy to create that packaging, because it is a flexible material and not a hard, heavy material like metals or glass, it's a lot less energy intensive to create these mixed materials. And if you don't know what a mixed material is, I guess I should have started with that. But if you don't know, this is things like toothpaste. Plastic aluminum laminates are a mixed material because they are plastic and aluminum. Things like Tetra Paks that a lot of plant-based milks come in, that is a mixed material because it has paper, a very thin aluminum layer, and plastic. And the way most of our recycling systems are set up is to break down this one material into this one material. And that's why these mixed materials are nearly impossible to recycle unless you have special programs near you that the brand is paying for, which a lot of times are inaccessible to most people. But because of all those positives I just listed about mixed materials, the negative is that they're hard to recycle. But I feel like when we look at all of the materials that we've talked about today, instead of focusing on which one we should be picking that's the best because most of them are not good at all, we should be looking at how to make recycling more accessible for mixed materials. I honestly think that as far as packaging goes, that's the biggest issue right now, because just because something is recyclable doesn't mean it's not going to end up as litter and wreak havoc in our environment, right? We can make the #1 plastics the most recyclable possible, and they're still one of the most littered items. So writing off mixed materials just because they're not recyclable, I personally don't think is the best solution to our overall crisis. I think we need recycling facilities for these mixed materials so that people who are willing and able to recycle can do so. Here's a material I hate, but that so many people in my family use: Styrofoam. I hate this one so much because it is nearly impossible to recycle, but comes with all of the negatives of so many other things. It's so easy to break down the way it breaks apart because it's so lightweight. It's also super easy to get off of garbage trucks and become litter because it's so lightweight. And styrofoam is the #1 littered material, likely because of the lightweight like I talked about. But it also fills up 30% of landfills globally. In my opinion, this is the absolute worst of the worst. It is created from petroleum as well. It's just another form of plastic. It doesn't do a great job at preserving anything. I don't know why this is, because a lot of you tell me in the comments that this is not happening where you live. But personally for me, where I live, I know a lot of people who use disposable plates on a daily basis, literally in their homes. It's honestly the craziest thing to me that someone will pay for a plate to throw it away repeatedly instead of throwing something in a dishwasher. Like, these are very privileged people who have dishwashers, who have the means to use a dishwasher, and instead they throw plates away. But to make it even worse, some of these people I'm talking about buy styrofoam plates on a weekly basis. And I'm not talking about this being just my most wasteful family members. Like, literally everyone in my family has a disposable plate stack in their home, but it blows my mind that a material like styrofoam is literally even legal to use as a disposable. It blows my mind. Styrofoam is the worst of the worst, in my opinion, but let me know what you think. Now on to the material that I personally think is one of the most sustainable materials, at least as the market currently stands, and that is recycled materials of nearly any kind. It is creating that circular system like we need, right? Although reusing is more circular than recycling, when we create this circular system where a manufacturer makes something, you use it, it gets recycled, they make the product again. You get it? You know, this is still a circle. And so I think using recycled materials is one of the most sustainable things we can do, by not having to deal with all the issues of heating up new resources with the furnaces like we talked about, all the issues of mining, which is incredibly unsustainable and unethical, waste getting into our environment and breaking down. If we're using the waste instead of throwing it away, then it's not going to end up in our oceans or in our landfills. And on top of that, it makes all of this more efficient because it is a profitable system. And so once we get to that point, we'll be in a much better place in my personal opinion. And so I think no matter what it is, if it's a thin plastic, if it's a hard plastic, if it's glass, if it's aluminum, whatever it is, if it's a recycled material, I think that is the most sustainable choice as things currently stand. I hope you learned something from this video. I absolutely loved making it. Doing this research was really fun for me, and it's so easy for me to just talk off the top of my head because this is the stuff I'm really passionate about. Let me know your thoughts on each of these materials, if you think they're sustainable or not, or if I missed a material. A packaging material specifically, because I know there are more sustainable materials out there, but typically not used for packaging. Anyway, check out CVS at the link at the top of the description. I'm really happy to partner with them on this video that's mostly just about education. The Total Home Earth Essentials line will be linked in the top of my description. And remember, until next time, you cannot do all the good that the world needs, but the world needs all the good that you can do. Bye guys.